A man who spent nearly his entire life on the battlefield, a name that echoed across the vast lands of Asia, carried by the winds. Imagine a man who spent nearly his entire life on the battlefield, a name that echoed across the vast lands of Asia, carried by the winds. The story of Asgard, the rogue lord's generals experienced by nation and ancestors. Alexander, he wasn't just a leader who conquered lands. Everywhere he went, he brought his culture, his philosophy. He used not only his sword, but also his wisdom and intellect to leave a mark on the places he conquered. But my friends, to call him just a conqueror would be the greatest injustice to that great man, because Alexander carried a grand ideal in his heart: to unite the world under one roof, to bring civilizations together and create a world where people lived together as brothers under the same stars. As he stepped onto the battlefields, this dream was always in his mind. It gave strength to his sword and quickened his steps. Now, let me tell you how this epic journey of Alexander began. From his childhood to how fate shaped him into the ruler he became, and the eternal fire of conquest that burned in his heart. Yes, my dear friends, you might be wondering, where did his story begin? What power, what events turned him into the conqueror of the East? Hold on tight, my friends, because we're about to step into this magical tale. Ah, my dear friends, the story of Alexander the Great is not just an ordinary tale of heroism. His life, from childhood, was like the beginning of an epic. He was born as the son of the mighty King Philip II of Macedonia. But Philip wasn't just Alexander's father. He was also a leader who passed on a powerful warrior spirit to his son. Imagine this. Alexander's childhood was spent in a palace where discussions about war strategies and government were daily conversations. His father, Philip, didn't just show him how to expand territories. He showed him how to rule a kingdom. And it was here that the warrior blood running through young Alexander's veins started to take shape. And then there's his mother, Olympias. This woman lit an eternal fire in Alexander's heart. Olympias wasn't just any queen. She was a respected princess from Epirus, a region known in the ancient world. She was mysterious and powerful, fiercely devoted to her son, always wanting the best for him, while also introducing him to the world of myths and gods. It's said that Olympias often told Alexander that he wasn't just an ordinary human, but someone chosen by the gods. The endless dream of conquest that Alexander carried in his mind and heart was passed down from his mother. He grew up believing not just in gods, but in the idea that he was descended from them. This belief made him an unstoppable leader, a conqueror always striving for more. Now, let's talk about Alexander's mentor, the famous philosopher Aristotle. Philip didn't want his son to be just a warrior. To teach him how to understand the world, think critically, and question everything, he brought Aristotle, the greatest philosopher of the time, into the palace. Aristotle introduced Alexander's young mind to philosophy and science. He taught him Homer's epics, the secrets of nature, morality, and justice. Alexander didn't just learn how to fight from this education. He also learned how to delve deep into the human soul. Aristotle didn't just teach him to think, but also how to understand and respect people. This combination of wisdom and courage would eventually set Alexander apart and elevate him far beyond being just another ruler. Even at a young age, those around Alexander knew he was no ordinary person. The courage and leadership he displayed as a child caught the attention of many. One story tells of how, as a boy, he did something that amazed the adults around him. He tamed one of his father's best war horses, the famous Bucephalus, which no one else could control. This act revealed Alexander's fearless spirit, determination, and sharp intelligence. And when his father, Philip, saw this success, he turned to his son and said, "Son, you should find yourself another kingdom. Macedonia is too small for you." From that day on, Alexander was known not as a mere prince, but as a leader with great dreams. And so began Alexander's story, my friends. But how would this young leader use the legacy left by his father and teacher to build a massive empire? What awaited him? In the next chapter, we'll explore how Alexander transformed from a young man with a strong foundation into the great ruler he became. My dear friends, let me tell you how Alexander made the leap from the innocent courage of his childhood to becoming a great leader. His life, which began under the shadow of his father Philip, eventually transitioned into a period where he would shine alone on the throne of Macedonia like a rising sun. Alexander's rise to power is a story woven with blood, wisdom, and an iron will. But before it could go on forever, a strange little accident happened. The death of his father, King Philip II, caused a storm to erupt in the Macedonian palace. Philip's death left many political gaps and forced young Alexander to take the throne at an age when most men are still finding their way. Before he had even turned 20, he found himself at the head of the Macedonian kingdom. Imagine that. Young Alexander had to take on the responsibility of ruling the country after his father's death. But this was not just about sitting on the throne. It was about protecting, strengthening, and surpassing the legacy his father had left behind. His first task was to confront internal uprisings. There were those in the palace claiming the throne, rebels stirring unrest across Macedonia, and Greek city-states dreaming of independence. When these city-states learned of Philip's death, they thought that Macedonia would now be led by a young king and believed it was the perfect time to declare their independence. Powerful cities like Athens and Thebes thought that Macedonia had weakened, but Alexander wasted no time in turning the situation to his advantage. The moment he took the throne, he was determined to prove to his enemies that he should never be underestimated. First, he crushed the revolts within Macedonia. Every threat he faced was destroyed with his intelligence and firmness. This young leader established an iron discipline in Macedonia, earning the trust and respect of his people. Not satisfied with just this victory, Alexander then turned his attention to the Greek city-states. He aimed to be recognized as the power that ruled all of Greece, and to unite the Greek people under one banner. He created the Corinthian League, a political structure that united the Greek city-states under the Macedonian flag. In the council of leaders he gathered in Corinth, they declared him the supreme commander of all Greece. This wasn't just a military title. It was an honor that would allow Alexander to enter the hearts of the Greek lands. So why all this effort? Alexander wanted to unite the Greek people and build a strong army because his eyes were set on the east. The time had come to carry out the great Asian campaign that his father Philip had dreamed of. For Alexander, this was not just a military campaign, but also a journey of self-discovery, a path to fulfill the destiny the gods had set for him. He wanted to inherit his father's plans and shape them with his own passion and ambition. My dear friends, Alexander was now a young ruler with a heart that beat like a door opening to the rich lands of the East. Now, with this united force, he would march toward the Persian Empire, and history would soon change. In the next chapter, we will see how the first campaigns against Persia turned into victories for this young king. I will tell you how Alexander's name began to be written in the pages of history in golden letters. My friends, after Alexander united the Greek lands and strengthened the power of the kingdom of Macedon, he set his sights on the endless lands of the East. The grand dream his father had built years ago burned like fire in young Alexander's heart. He would bring the Persian Empire to its knees and turn all of Asia into a conquest dream. And that day had come when he crossed the Hellespont, what we now call the Dardanelles, and set foot on the Asian lands. He was not just stepping into new territory. He was changing the course of history. Now only one step remained: to face the Persians, to clash sword to sword, and to overthrow the kings who had ruled these lands for centuries. You see, my friends, when Alexander crossed the Hellespont, he wasn't making a simple journey, as you might read in history books. This was a one-way trip, a journey that would take him against the most powerful empire of the ancient world with no turning back. They say that when Alexander set foot on Asian soil, he made sacrifices to the gods, wishing for divine blessing on his quest to conquer these lands. With every step, he knew he was not just carving out his own fate, but the fate of the thousands of soldiers and hundreds of thousands of people who followed him. This young king with great ambitions was fearless. He felt a power within him that he believed the gods had given him, a power that would enable him to stand against the Persians and bring hope and freedom to the people they ruled. His first major test came at the Granicus River. When the Persian generals and local satraps realized that Alexander wouldn't stop, they decided to meet him on the riverbank. For Alexander, it was not just about victory. It was about showing his enemies that he was there to stay. And that's exactly what happened at the Battle of Granicus. No matter how powerful the Persian army was, Alexander's intelligence and bravery turned the tide on the battlefield. As he charged his horse into the river and attacked the Persian lines, his soldiers followed him without hesitation, ready to face death by his side. His courage on the battlefield inspired such passion in the Macedonian army that the Persian forces were completely scattered on the banks of the Granicus River. This victory, my friends, was a turning point in Alexander's Asian campaign. After Granicus, the gates to western Anatolia were wide open to him. But he didn't just win battles. Many cities in Anatolia welcomed him as a hero, a liberator. The local people who had been oppressed under Persian rule saw Alexander as the people showed hope and gratitude. To them, Alexander wasn't just a conqueror, he was the herald of a new era, a savior. Now, my friends, just think about this for a moment. A young king fresh off a great victory, left behind conquered lands and the love of the people he had won over. But would that be the end of it? Of course not. Alexander's eyes were still set further east. Ahead of him lay the mighty Persian Empire. And with every step, he was moving closer to the great battle against its greatest ruler, King Darius III. So, what comes next? Well, let's find out together. My dear friends. As we turn the pages of history, we come to a battle where two great forces will meet for the first time. Alexander and King Darius of Persia. Alexander's young and fiery heart burned with the desire to conquer Persian lands, while Darius, with his mighty army, was determined to protect his throne and empire. The stage was set near the plains of Issus. You know how much this battle meant to both Alexander as a bold commander and to Darius as a powerful ruler. This wasn't just a clash between two armies. It was a collision of two worlds. Imagine, as Alexander entered this battle, he was looking to conquer all of Asia with his soldiers by his side. No matter how tired they were, they found new strength from the victory they had won at Granicus and from Alexander's words filled with belief. Facing them was the seemingly endless Persian army. Darius had equipped his forces with overwhelming numbers, but he hadn't counted on Alexander's clever strategies. Leading the charge at the front of his army, Alexander showed his soldiers his complete confidence. When the Battle of Issus began, Alexander's soldiers moved with strict discipline. Darius's army was large, but Alexander's brilliant tactics rendered their numerical advantage useless. He knew exactly where the enemy was weakest. He attacked the center, flanked them from the sides, and caused chaos in the Persian lines. Even when Darius realized he was losing, he still believed he could protect his throne. But Alexander's speed and agility, fueled by the spirit of a young warrior, struck straight to the heart of his enemy. And friends, Alexander didn't just win a victory here. He captured Darius's entire family. The Queen of Persia, Darius's mother, and his children were now in the hands of the Macedonians. Just think about it for a moment. Alexander now had the family of a king in his possession. The most valuable assets of his enemy were in his grasp. But here another side of Alexander showed itself. His mercy. Maybe not what you'd expect, but Alexander treated Darius's family with the utmost respect and kindness. He protected them as though they were his own family, not prisoners. He treated Darius's mother like royalty, safeguarding her dignity. Even while Darius's family was held captive, Alexander's grace echoed throughout the lands. You see, my friends, the true power of a leader isn't just in their victories, but in the humanity they show after those victories. This victory dealt a heavy blow to the Persian Empire, and rumors of weakness began to spread among Darius's people. But Alexander wasn't stopping. His eyes were now focused on the east, on the very heart of Darius's empire. He was now only one step closer to to bringing the mighty Persian Empire to its knees. So what do you think will be his next move? Get ready, my friends, because the journey has only just begun. Now we're reaching a turning point in Alexander's grand journey, my friends. His eyes were now set on Phoenicia and Egypt. The mysteries of the East and the riches of its civilizations were pulling him forward, step by step. It was in these moments that Alexander wasn't just a warrior. He was a young king determined to carve out his own destiny. Someone with dreams. Looking ahead, he saw the wealthy ports of Phoenicia and its cities surrounded by strong walls. Each of these cities was a bearer of civilization, and conquering them would open the doors to his dominance in the East. One of the toughest cities in Phoenicia was, of course, Tyre. Tyre was an island fortress surrounded by massive walls, as if it were an unreachable island. Just imagine, Alexander and his soldiers were staring at Tyre's towering walls. There was no way to reach it from land. Alexander had to do something that no one had ever managed before. But our young king was known for his courage. Alexander decided to build a causeway made of stones and earth from the mainland to the island. This monumental effort, lasting months, showed just how determined he was to break the resistance of Phoenicia's powerful city-states. Eventually, Tyre's walls were breached. The city was taken, and Alexander's resolve was declared to the world. With his courage further solidified by the Phoenician victory, Alexander's next stop was Egypt. Egypt, the fertile lands of the Nile, home to the pharaohs who had ruled for centuries, a land full of ancient knowledge and mystery. When Alexander set foot on Egyptian soil, the Egyptians didn't greet him like an ordinary conqueror. They welcomed him as their savior. At that time, Egypt was under the pressure of the Persians, and the people were waiting for a new leader. When Alexander entered Egypt, he was met with the love of the people. There was a sense of victory in the streets. He was no longer just a Macedonian king. In the eyes of the Egyptians, he was their savior, their new leader. And here in Egypt, Alexander declared himself a god king, much like the pharaohs before him. Becoming a god king was another way for him to cement his place in the hearts of the Egyptian people, and perhaps even a challenge to history itself. This young king, bent on ruling the world, was transforming into a divine figure, not just a soldier or ruler. At that point, Alexander began to see himself not only as a Macedonian leader, but as a universal ruler, almost a sacred figure. And my friends, in these lands, he founded a city that would forever be remembered in history, Alexandria. Yes, in the sacred land of Egypt, Alexander founded a city bearing his name, a city that would become the center of knowledge and the arts, the heart of culture and civilization for centuries to come. Alexandria began to rise as a legacy that immortalized his name and carried it beyond time. So, as we see, Alexander was rising on the stage of history as both a conqueror, a savior, and a founder of culture. But for him, this was just the beginning. After breaking through Phoenicia's impenetrable walls and being accepted as a god king in Egypt, Alexander had his eyes set on even greater conquests. What was next? My friends, the difficult path to the heart of the Persians, to Darius's throne, awaited him. Are you ready? Let's continue this adventure together. My friends, Now we come to one of the most epic and challenging journeys in Alexander's life, the moments when he set his sights on the heart of the Persian Empire. This journey, which became the most significant and dazzling link in the chain of his conquests, was filled with victories that would change the course of history. Yes, after Egypt, Alexander's eyes were fixed on the heart of Persia, on Babylon and beyond. But reaching those lands wouldn't be easy, because this time he was facing the last stronghold of a massive empire, the final resistance. The story I'm about to tell you is one of a warrior who triumphed through both intellect and courage. As Alexander prepared his army, he knew this wouldn't be just any battle. It would be an epic confrontation. This war would test his strength against the power of the Persian Empire once again, and it would be one of history's defining moments. And there it was, the plains of Gaugamela. There, on the vast, barren flatlands, two great armies would face each other. Persian King Darius had come to the battlefield prepared. He had full confidence in his army. It was equipped with armored elephants, mighty warriors, and massive war chariots. Ah, my friends, Darius's power was indeed magnificent, but Alexander's will was stronger than anything else. Picture the moment when the battle began, the dusty plains of Gaugamela echoing with the clash of swords and the roar of battle cries. Alexander's army was outnumbered by the Persian forces, but his strategy was flawless. He directed his army like a sharp arrow, aiming it straight for the heart of the enemy. They pierced through Darius's armored forces. The Persians were stunned by this unexpected attack. Alexander's units, sharpened like a spear, charged forward like a massive wave, scattering the enemy, so much so that even Darius himself had to flee. With this victory, Alexander had broken the backbone of the Persian Empire and changed the fate of a massive empire. And so, my friends, the Battle of Gaugamela was etched into history, crowning Alexander as an invincible leader. With Darius's retreat, Alexander now ruled over the Persian Empire's lands. But these lands weren't just places to win through battle. They held riches, treasures, and ancient cities. And eventually, Alexander set his sights on the fascinating city of Babylon. Babylon. For years it had been the jewel of the Persian Empire, home to some of the greatest riches of the East, and now it was waiting for Alexander. With great grandeur he entered the city, welcomed by the cheers and adoration of the people. It was as if even Babylon had surrendered to him. The streets had turned into a victory parade, and the people greeted Alexander like a hero. And then, the legendary treasures of Babylon. With Alexander's conquest of the city, all the wealth that the Persian Empire had accumulated passed into his hands. Gold, jewels, artworks. Each of these treasures reflected the rich history of the East. But these riches weren't just material. They symbolized Alexander's power, the admiration and fear people felt toward him. Babylon was not just a city, it became a symbol of Alexander's victories in the East. Thus, Alexander became the ruler of Persia, but his eyes were still on the horizon, on the lands beyond, in the unknown reaches of the East. Fate was calling him farther still. As for Darius, after his defeat, he had fallen, and the man who was once the world's most powerful ruler would go down in history as a fleeing king. Now Alexander's journey will take him even further, all the way to India. There, new lands, unfamiliar cultures, and new challenges await him. Ah, my friends, this story doesn't end here. Alexander's dream of conquest would continue as long as there were boundaries to push. Ah, my dear friends, today I want to talk to you about one of the most pivotal moments in Alexander's journey, his conquest of Persepolis. Imagine the magnificent capital of the Persian Empire, a city where kings, generals, and the empire's vast riches were all gathered, a city that had become the stuff of legends. Alexander had finally reached it. But this wasn't just any journey. This was the ultimate banner raised in the heart of the Persian Empire. Persepolis had been the symbol of Persian culture and power for centuries. The city was practically a work of art with its grand palaces, temples, and towering columns that awed anyone who laid eyes on it. When Alexander arrived to claim his victory, he didn't just encounter a city. He found an entire history and culture. When Alexander's army captured Persepolis, the final stronghold of the mighty Persian Empire fell. But it wasn't just a conquest or a victory. It was also the backdrop for a difficult decision and heavy consequences. A chapter that would define much more than a battle. The riches of this magnificent city were dazzling. The palace rooms were filled with gold, silver, precious stones, and pearls. All these treasures were the accumulated wealth and power of Persian kings over the years. But to Alexander, Persepolis wasn't just a prize or a city. It was the very symbol of the Persian Empire, the heart of Asia and the pinnacle of civilization. Winning here for Alexander meant he had truly become the conqueror of Asia. However, my dear friends, this is where a crucial turning point came. Some accounts say that Persepolis had to be set on fire as retribution for the sacred temples and palaces of the city. But this wasn't just carelessness or loss of control. The decision to burn the city was driven by revenge and a display of power. Some say that Persepolis had to be set on fire as retribution for the Persian destruction of Greek temples and cities. This fire represented the revenge of the past and the end of the Persian Empire's centuries-long grandeur. The burning of Persepolis became a symbol, perhaps the closing chapter of an era in history. As the grand palaces, massive temples, and monuments burned one by one, Alexander and his army watched the massive blaze unfold. Some sources even say that Alexander couldn't hide his deep shock and regret as the flames rose. In that moment, he realized that they weren't just destroying a city. They were destroying a whole civilization. The destruction of Persepolis marked the peak of Alexander's victory, but also began a deep transformation within him. After this, it is said that Alexander started to feel more connected to Persian culture and traditions. He began to hold ceremonies in the same way the Persians did, wore their clothes, and adopted their conqueror. And in this way, he wasn't just seen as a conqueror, but as the new ruler of the East, even a part of it. As Alexander grew closer to the Persians, he developed a deep respect for their culture and made an effort to learn more about them. This wasn't just about conquering, it was the beginning of a deeper journey to bridge the gap between cultures. And so, my friends, while Alexander's eyes were always fixed on new adventures, on unknown lands beyond the horizon, he rose from the ashes of Persepolis as a ruler who blended old and new identities. This fire became a turning point for him, as he no longer saw himself as just a conqueror, but as a leader who wanted to be accepted as part of the East. In the end, this journey wouldn't just see him remembered as a warrior. He would become a legend, the one who united the East and West. Now we've reached that pivotal moment in Alexander's story, when Darius's downfall marked a huge turning point for the mighty Persian Empire. My friends, such a vast empire had represented the splendor, wealth, and power of the East for over 300 years. Who could have imagined that this colossal state of Asia, with all its traditions and countless victories, would eventually crumble? Yet it was Alexander's unstoppable will and Darius's fall that paved the way for all of this. After Darius's defeat at the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander's victory was sealed, but Darius was still on the run, retreating eastward. His escape was one of desperation. He tried nearly every possible way to get away from Alexander, seeking help from his own allies and men. However, things didn't go as planned for Darius. His own people were gradually losing faith in him, and they were already considering other potential rulers for the Persian throne. And so one day, the devastating news spread across the world. King Darius of Persia had died, betrayed by a group of Persian nobles, and met his end in his own land. This wasn't just the end of Darius, but the fall of the Persian Empire itself. For when the news reached Alexander, nothing stood in his way from claiming himself as the sole heir and ruler of the entire empire. When Alexander ascended the Persian throne, he wasn't just a conqueror. He began to act as a peacemaker and a unifier of cultures. He chose to work in harmony with the Persian nobles and showed respect for their traditions. Because of this, the Persian people, who initially saw him as an enemy, gradually started to respect him. It's even said that Alexander made his own commanders swear allegiance in ceremonies following Persian customs, and that he began to dress like the Persian nobility. This was, on one hand, a way to gain the trust of the people he had conquered, but on the other hand, it symbolized his belief in himself as the ruler of a new empire. Yes, my friends, Alexander was no longer just the king of Macedonia. Now he was the king of Asia as well. But with all this power and glory, who knows what other ambitions stirred in Alexander's heart? My friends, I'm so excited because we've reached one of the most crucial turning points in Alexander's story. As he moved forward into the mysterious lands of the East, the fire of conquest burned so brightly in Alexander's eyes that he set out with his entire army, driven by nothing but that passion. Day and night he marched without rest, and every village, every valley became the doorway to a new adventure. Even the gods must have been watching his unwavering determination, wondering where such a bold heart would lead him. And friends, as he journeyed toward India, enduring the scorching heat of the desert and the bitter cold of the high mountains to keep his army moving, this was yet another display of Alexander's strategic genius. The great king was no ordinary ruler. He was a military mastermind who always thought a step ahead, crafting each move with the future in mind. Before advancing, he would send scouts, hold talks with local people, and carefully study every part of these exotic lands. Friends, in his mind, every region. Every piece of land was like a battlefield. He would analyze how best to position his army, which river or hill might hide an enemy, and he did all of this almost by instinct, step by step. Finally, when Alexander and his army reached India, he quickly realized the foreign warriors in these lands were incredibly strong, for in his path stood a leader named Porus, who ruled the south of Punjab. This man, according to legend, was said to be so enormous and mighty that it seemed as though he drew his strength from the very earth itself. His height and presence were legendary. He was so imposing that his mere presence could silence a crowd. This courageous leader seemed to embody the very spirit of India, resolute, stubborn, and unstoppable. Oh, it had been a long time since Alexander had encountered such a warrior. The fearless challenge of his opponent, standing against him with defiance, made the king grip his sword even tighter. And my friends, when Alexander's army finally came face to face with Porus's massive elephants on the banks of the Indus River, well, that's when one of the most unforgettable moments in history took place. Just imagine the size and strength of these elephants. Each one was like a tower, carrying soldiers with enormous shields on their backs, staring down Alexander's army. The battlefield came alive with the charging of horses, the gleam of swords and spears, and as the cool river water mixed with the chaos of battle, it felt as if time itself had paused. Both sides may have hesitated for a moment, for such a clash of power was rare in history, but Alexander was fearless. Neither the difficulty of the battle nor the strength of the elephants could extinguish his resolve. He gave the order, and the battle began. The uproar on the battlefield felt like the clash of two natural forces. Porus's army, with its elephants, fought with all its might to push Alexander's troops back. Those magnificent elephants tried to tear apart Alexander's cavalry, but Alexander's military genius knew exactly how to counter these giant creatures. The cavalry retreated, and the spearmen met the elephants face to face. It was a breathtaking battle, friends, one where swords flashed, soldiers fought with all their might, and both sides put on an epic show of endurance in the midst of the chaos. In the end, Alexander emerged victorious, but this victory didn't just bring him more land. It earned him a new ally. Alexander had come to respect Porus's bravery, his warrior's spirit, and his leadership. And, friends, this respect grew so much that Alexander saw Porus as an ally, returned his lands to him, and embraced the brave leader of India as a friend. Alexander's decision was one of the greatest acts of kindness after a battle during those times. But now, a question lingers in my mind. Did this victory only fuel Alexander's desire for conquest even more? How much further did Alexander plan to go on this journey? Let's see what his next move will be. My dear friends, here we are, facing, perhaps, the most human and touching side of Alexander's journey. His great desire for conquest had taken him all the way to India, where he had defeated countless enemies and gained many allies along the way. But during these long campaigns, Alexander's army began to struggle with an unyielding fatigue. The fire in their eyes, which had burned so brightly at the start, had gradually dimmed with every battle every victory, and every passing day. The years spent away from their homes, their loved ones, and the familiar lands had slowly worn down the strength of the army. Yes, while Alexander himself seemed tireless, there was an increasing weariness in the faces of his men with each passing day. At this point, Alexander's ambition clashed with the exhaustion of his soldiers. The great king always wanted more. The mysteries of distant lands seemed like a magnet to him, but his army was tired and longed for a break, maybe even to return to the lands they missed. Some of them had left behind their youth, their families, and everything they knew, chasing after Alexander's endless thirst for conquest. Was there a reward for all the sweat and blood spilled in these far-off countries? Maybe Alexander still looked beyond, to the horizon and beyond, even as they reached the limits of their journey. But his army no longer shared that same determination. As they made their way through the deep forests and misty mountains of India, one morning, Alexander noticed that his entire army had stopped. Their heads hung low with exhaustion, their shields no longer held high, and their feet no longer wanted to take another step. Battles may have been left behind, but this silent rebellion was just as powerful as any fight. The men were tired, spent, and no longer wanted to push forward. Alexander looked into the eyes of his soldiers. Their shoulders slumped, and saw a sense of defeat in their spirits. Oh, my friends, this moment was truly painful. It squeezed your heart. Each of them that had been loyal to Alexander, but they now felt like they had reached the end of the road. And so at that point, Alexander was forced to listen to them, even though he didn't want to. There was no point in pushing them further beyond their loyalty. Their physical limits had been reached. A sadness fell over Alexander. This young king, who had always sought further horizons, now had no choice but to turn back. The decision to return to Babylon was both a victory and a farewell. Now he would have to settle for what he had gained. The stories of India would live on in memory, but the exhaustion they had felt would perhaps follow them for the rest of their lives. And so Alexander began the journey back to Babylon with his army, leaving behind all his dreams of the East. But friends, could this return be the end for him? Or would a new adventure await him in Babylon? Who knows what fate had in store for him? Ah, my dear friends, as Alexander made his way back to Babylon, his ambition was still burning strong. In his young eyes, gazing at the vast horizons, there were still lands to conquer and obstacles to overcome. When he passed through the grand gates of Babylon, leading his returning army, the city welcomed them like a celebration, like a homeland. There were jubilant festivities in the squares, songs were sung, and the taste of victory was savored to the fullest. As Alexander displayed the glory of his conquests before the world, he was already dreaming up new ones. But my friends, behind these grand celebrations, a sense of fragility was beginning to settle inside Alexander. This young king, who had always moved forward with his eyes fixed on the horizon, was now finally feeling the exhaustion brought on by long campaigns and hard-fought battles. His body was no longer able to keep up with his grand dreams. As the days passed in Babylon, Alexander's health began to deteriorate. fighting a high fever. One morning he found himself too weak to even ascend to his throne. This young man, who had gained immortality through his achievements, was now facing his own mortality, just like any of us. And so the final days arrived. Alexander fell into bed, surrounded by his most loyal friends, commanders, and advisors. Everyone had one question on their minds: what would happen after Alexander? Because this empire, brought together by his strength, was now left leaderless. One last time, he opened his eyes and looked around at those gathered around him. Perhaps there was a sense of peace on his face, or maybe a hint of sorrow. As the great ruler took his last breath, he left behind an empire, a story, a legend. Alexander's death sent shockwaves through the world. His empire was plunged into a deep void. In his absence, conflicts broke out among his lands. The kingdoms he had conquered began to argue over his legacy. But my friends, Alexander's legacy wasn't just about the land and armies. His legacy lay in the ideals he spread across the world, in the merging of cultures, and in the blending of East and West. His conquests may have ended, but the dreams he built would live on for centuries. Ah, my dear friends, do you think one day we will retell this magnificent journey that began in Babylon and stretched all the way to India? Perhaps Alexander's dreams will once again come to life in our own horizons. Ah, my dear friends, while Alexander's grand dreams and victories on the battlefield may have come to an end one day, the marks he left behind will never be erased. After his death, the Hellenistic era began, and like Alexander's spirit, it spread and echoed across the world. Everywhere he went, the cultural legacy he left behind made his name immortal. What I am about to share is about that endless influence, because Alexander not only left his mark in the lands he conquered, but also in the hearts and minds of the people who lived there. The cities Alexandra founded became centers of culture. The great Alexandra didn't just pass through places like a ruler, he built everywhere, as if it were his home. Especially in Egypt, the city he founded, Alexandria, became a cultural hub with its libraries, art centers, and scholars. The Library of Alexandria might have been the brightest example of this legacy. Containing thousands of manuscripts, it was considered the greatest repository of knowledge of that time. People gathered in this city, freely exchanging ideas on science, philosophy, and art. This, my friends, is where the cultural mosaic that Alexander dreamed of began to take root. Every society that Alexander touched took a piece of him and added it to their own traditions and values. The East and West had never blended so deeply before. The Persians, influenced by Greek culture, began to show more interest in philosophy and science. While the Greek world was being influenced by the rich mythology and cosmopolitan nature of the Persians, even today, the effects of this cultural fusion continue to live on in our art, language, and beliefs. But was Alexander's influence only reflected in the lands, languages, and cities? Of course not. His passion for uniting the East and West still sends a message to us today. His spirit imagined a world where people understood and respected one another, breaking through cultural boundaries. And so, my dear friends, the legacy of Alexander the Great continues to live not just in his time, but in every era. even today his dream still guides us in how we see ourselves and the world around us. My dear friends, what a journey it has been. As I have shared the story of Alexander the Great with you, we've walked side by side on the battlefields, crossed harsh deserts and climbed mountains. But now it's time to return from a world where the traces he left still live on, back to our own world. But remember, this story doesn't end here. Alexander's spirit, his dreams, and the legacy he left behind are still alive in the pages of history, in every bit of time. After all this adventure, we come to understand that Alexander was not just a conqueror, but a dreamer who touched hearts and cultures. His genius didn't make him a mere leader. It made him a traveler, a wise man, someone who saw the world as his home. The fires that burned on battlefields turned into flowers, blooming in city squares, and friendships blossomed among peoples in his vision, and this legacy of his still echoes around the world. Just like the soldiers who once marched behind him, we too continue to walk in the path of his thoughts and beliefs today. Remember, my friends, Alexander's story is our story. He showed us the way to break boundaries, embrace differences, and see the world as a whole. And who knows, maybe one day in our own lives, we too can leave behind traces like his, so that one day future generations will say about us, their story didn't end here. Thank you for listening, my dear friends. Perhaps this story ends here, but the pages of this great epic we call history are still being written. I hope one day we'll meet again to share more stories of other heroes in other lands. For now, goodbye, and remember, history always whispers to us, just listen.